I'd like to also now introduce Al Brand from Niesler Rutledge, also a figure that's very familiar to many of you in the room as he's been one of the major geotechnical engineering firms in the city for decades now, very the foremost one. So, Al.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Actually, my firm is 109 years old. I've only been with them a little bit less than half of that time, 51 years. And I want to talk about the value of historic geotechnical data. One of the things that the founders of my firm recognized was that each project they did generated subsurface information which would be valuable for the future jobs, for general characteristics. And they were great in collecting that data. But there are public sources of data, and they include geologic maps and historic topographic maps, New York City rock data maps. One of the questioners actually raised that issue, and I'll show you an example of what they are. New York City Transit Archives, New York City Department of Buildings. Again, valuable data, just hard to access from a public-private point of view. And then we have the proprietary information held by many consulting firms. My firm happens to be among the oldest in the city. There are a few others that are bigger firms that have geotechnical groups that are of similar age, and then there are a bunch of younger firms. But each firm has collected its own geotechnical database, but they're all separate, and they're not coordinated. And frankly, the private firms consider that proprietary information a competitive advantage. But from a public point of view, the data that's out there in the public realm really needs to be coordinated and standardized and made available to everybody. So geologic maps, just to illustrate what a geologic map of New York City might look like, that's it, the New York 5 boroughs, where the rock is colored in green, and then we have the glacial moraine, which is that cross-hatched orange, and the outwash sands. This tells us very early on what the likely subsurface condition is going to be. Historical maps. This is the Veely map of 1865, often used in our business in Manhattan, to tell us where we're going to have fills around the perimeter of the island and where internally we're going to have problem soils because of former lakes and streams that are no longer visible. There's no evidence of these now as you're walking the streets. But when we drill borings in an area, this map shows an old stream or a swamp, we find poor soil conditions. So it's a starting point for us, and this is public information widely available. The interesting thing is that the present technology for soil sampling, which is based on a tool called the split spoon, and the data that we get from it is called the standard penetration test, was developed in the 1930s and 1940s. And that's a picture of a rig using exactly the same equipment that we use today, a 140-pound hammer pulling 30 inches on a split spoon sampler to get a sample of soil. So data that was carefully collected in the 1930s is extremely valuable today in telling us, informing us, and allowing us to refine subsurface explorations on a present project. There's a little bit of difference in the hammer now. They have safety hammers, so the driller isn't quite at risk of losing a finger when the hammer falls. But the technology of a 140-pound hammer falling 30 inches, standard penetration test hasn't changed. The Manhattan rock data maps. So the gentleman raised that question in the Depression era. The Works Project Administration started a project of collecting borings throughout the 5 boroughs of New York, and they collected them and posted on maps locations of borings, whether they encountered rock or not, and then made very simple graphic logs that show where the rock is, what the elevation of the rock is, and with very simple terms, what the soil profile above the rock is. These maps are now in the custody of the New York City Department of Design and Construction. The problem is they're not easy to get. If you know they exist, you can go to the DDC website, and in their FOIL report, Freedom of Information portal, you can ask for this, and if you're lucky, in 6 or 8 weeks, you'll get a response. But it's very helpful if you actually know which map section and which boring you're looking for. But if you're just looking for, in general, I want this area of Manhattan, it could take quite a while before you actually get some information. Very valuable resource. I have to say, in my firm, in the 1940s, my firm collected a lot of these maps, and we have them. But we understand they have been updated to some extent since they were originally created, but they're not easy to access by any means. New York City Transit, there are subway lines all over New York City, both underground and elevated. And each of them has some sort of a record. And if you go to New York City Transit and you ask for a specific section along a route and a section, you can get information. The green and blue lines that I've highlighted on here are the rock profile, east and west, along an alignment with subway. Very valuable information, but not readily available unless you go to outside projects with a specific location in mind and say, I need drawings for this area. Those logs that were used to create these were also put on the rock data maps if they were data that existed before about 1935. New York City Building Department requires a submittal of subsurface information with every building permit application. And this is the modern form. It's the technical report TR1, and you can see my big blue arrow where you have to actually put down that you have geotechnical information, borings or test bits. And then there's a supplemental TR4 that has to be filed, which includes a boring plan or test pit plan and logs of the subsurface exploration. All of that data gets logged in by the building department and is there. But in order to access it, you have to go job by job, site by site, block and lot number, and retrieve that data and hopefully find it. Now, we have had sporadic luck. We have, on some old projects, we've had good luck finding simple geotechnical data, and sometimes the data is just not in the files. For maybe at 20, 30, 40 years ago, whoever was the file clerk didn't think it was very important. I hope that today the building department is meticulously maintaining the files of everything that each private consultant has to file. Now, as far as Muser Rutledge, in our history of collecting data, we had, when I started the firm, we had manual maps where we put a red dot where we had a job and what that job number was. We've now taken that map and we've made a Google graphic of it so our people can find sites more quickly. But basically, it's a manual system. Each of the logs that we have for each project was copied and put in a binder. And we have walls of these things in our office for about 80 years of work. And it allows us internally to go and retrieve data for previous jobs without going to the actual archives, which are stored off-site, to pull the report in or the full data package. But we have internally a tremendous amount of data, and as I said, other firms in our industry have that similar data, maybe not as much as we do, but probably of equal quality. And I think a lesson here to be learned is if you have a project and you're starting with a reputable geotechnical firm, they probably have a background in some capacity to start and maybe save you some money on a future exploration. So I wanted to show a little simple example of a little history. This is at the World's Fair site. The World's Fair in 1939 was created in Flushing Meadow on a site that was ash-filled. If you've ever read The Great Gatsby, you know that they travel through the Valley of Ashes. That's it. And borings were made in 1936 for that development. This is a graphic of one of those logs. We actually have data for those borings, including soil sample descriptions, individual descriptions, and blow counts with the early SPT testing. In 1964, when the World's Fair was recreated on the same site, additional exploration was done in the early 60s. These are borings from the Unisphere. Very similar soil profile, more detail on the logs. A little side note, the actual timber piles from the Trilon and Perisphere were reused for the Unisphere, and they exist today. And then where the tennis center was built in 1994, we made additional borings And that's all three sets of borings are on essentially the same parcel of land, and we've used that data to inform us and simplify and streamline each successive future investigation. So historical geotechnical data is extremely valuable for preliminary evaluation of sites during feasibility studies, reducing the amount of required new exploration. Public data from New York City is difficult to find and get, and consulting firms often have extensive data, but that is also not readily available to the public. So thank you very much.
So Al, you told us about all of the data that gets collected ahead of the project. What about all the information that gets learned during the project? Are any firms actually out there collecting? I mean, every time we dig a hole, we put something in the ground, we see the ground.
Yes.
Are we doing anything about that?
Not in an organized way. The individual firms are learning from their experiences. For example, piled records are kept, piled load test data is kept. That informs our future designs. But in terms of a database that says, here's what we actually found versus what we predicted, it's not kept in any organized way.
Question, Ronaldo.
Have access to that data, but it's really your client's data. When the client is not there anymore, do you consider that your data or public data?
Well, if it's a project where, for example, the borings originally were filed with the building department, the records are actually public records. The data that we have, we use in a generic form. We don't share specific client data with another client. But the subsurface soil profile, what was learned on one project, can be extended to the next project within confidentiality.
Hi, I live in Las Vegas, very different geotechnical world. And I just learned something very surprising, which is that some of our geotech firms actually dispose of their data after 5 years because of liability concerns. Have you ever heard of that?
Yes, well, liability is a big issue for consultants. And I think a prudent firm would draw the line and say the soil data, which is really a logging of what's geologically underground, is something they should preserve. They may want to dispose of how they use that soil data to design a foundation in case somebody later challenges whether that was an appropriate use. But I think there can be a distinction made between factual data and interpretive use of that data.
Thank you very much.